Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for that introduction. I actually have 4 kids now because I'm Catholic, right? It's like, gotta keep updating that bio. In fact, I've given this talk twice before, and this is my first time giving it not being pregnant. And so I'm super stoked that I don't feel like I'm gonna throw up or tip over at any moment. So, well, Tyler said that he really wanted to put sexuality in the title of my talk to sex it up a bit. So if I don't talk about sex enough in my remarks, feel free to dig in the Q&A. We'll have kind of a long Q&A, I think, because that's my favorite mode, is to have more of an interactive back and forth with you all and the Zoomers as well. So let me pull out my notes here, get myself organized. I like these microphones. I always feel like a preacher when I have these microphones. Okay. So my talk is really going to be a sketch of my conversion story, and that will be sort of perhaps a departure point for further conversation afterwards. And so I'm here to share my story with you. I became Catholic 6 years ago, and it took about a year for the conversion to really start to take, for a new worldview to unfold and replace my old one. I was raised Christian, as was mentioned earlier, an evangelical Protestant. But the most difficult issues I wrestled with in my conversion were not the typical Protestant objections like the Pope and Mary. They were the feminist objections: an all-male priesthood, contraception, abortion, sexuality, gay marriage. Those were the things that I really had to wrestle with in my conversion, because I was coming to Catholicism from an atypical road, postmodern feminism. I'll get into exactly what I mean by that a little later. But to give you an illustration of how radical a leap it is to go from postmodern feminism to Roman Catholicism. It always sounds more intense when you make it Roman Catholicism too, not just like Roman. Okay. Here's an anecdote. In the summer of 2012, I was sick as a dog. I was laid out on the couch. I was in the throes of my first pregnancy, my sickest pregnancy also. I had really bad, they call it morning sickness, which is just a lie. It's all day, all the time, 24/7 sickness. And this was when the controversy about the birth control mandate in the Affordable Care Act was happening, if you remember that. So I remember looking at pictures of these male Catholic priests in their prim white collars, feeling enraged that they had the audacity to tell women what they should or shouldn't do with their bodies. Less than 2 years later, I was standing in front of one of those priests who was wearing full Easter vestments, and I was speaking these words: I believe and profess all that the Holy Catholic Church believes, teaches, and proclaims to be revealed by God. All. Ooh, I did choke a little on that word, I'll have to admit. So how the hell did I get there? How did I get from 2012 feeling enraged at the priest to standing in front of one and saying that I was ready to enter the Catholic Church? How did I go from being a professional feminist, an academic expert in postmodern gender and feminist theory, to a Roman Catholic who not only loves the church, but embraces all that she teaches? It's a weird story. I can't tell it all here. Lucky for you, I did write a book about it if you want to know the whole thing. But I do want to share one piece of it with you, namely the wisdom and the bounty I've discovered in the Catholic tradition about the goodness of being a woman and the goodness of having and being a body. I became a feminist in the first place because I had a deep felt desire to have my dignity as a woman specifically affirmed. But what I saw in feminism was ultimately, and surprisingly, found in Catholicism. Let me begin by describing where I come from and what drew me to feminism in the first place. So I grew up an evangelical in Utah and eastern Idaho, which is the Mormon belt in the western United States. So I grew up kind of in this evangelical bubble, inside a Mormon bubble. It was like a Russian nesting doll of religious conservatism. And there were some good things about my evangelical upbringing, so I don't want to come up here and just throw shade. I was raised to have a simple and sincere faith in Jesus, and from a very young age urged to give him my heart, to invite him into my heart. I was also immersed in scripture, or as we call it, the Bible with a capital B. I remember reading, I had this NIV study Bible I got for Christmas one year, and they have all these tracks in the beginning that you can read, different themed readings. And the only one I ever successfully finished and read multiple times was Women in the Bible. And so I just read and reread these stories, especially in the Old Testament, of women. And I had these tapes I would listen to at night, these dramatized stories of women in the Old Testament. And one of my favorites to listen to was Jezebel, because she's just kind of the best villain ever. I mean, she's horrible. And I was riveted by her story. And then there's the story of Deborah in Judges, and Jael with the tent spike through the head. I don't know if you've read that. You haven't read that, you really should. Of course, as a Protestant, I didn't have Judith in my canon of awesome Old Testament women. So you all are luckier than I was. I would have loved that. I mean, a tent spike is one thing, but full decapitation is pretty metal. So. But there were also some not so good things about my upbringing in an evangelical context. So beyond my own immersion in women's stories that I sort of sought out myself, women's stories and voices were not heard much at all in a church context. So in evangelical worship, there's no Eucharist or sacraments, there's just the sermon. The sermon is the centerpiece of worship, right? And it's usually like 45 minutes long. I think my most potent memory of church as a child is the vision of like the clock on the wall that seemed always suspended like 5 minutes before noon when church was supposed to end. That's like, I remember like looking back at it constantly like, oh, anyway. So there was a sermon, and I'll tell you, I never heard a sermon, and I mean never, about a woman growing up. Not Mary, not Sarah, not anyone, especially not Mary. Whew, yeah, no. She might like make a little cameo in Christmas, but that was sort of it. Then she would like shuffled off, never to be mentioned again. I also never saw women in any kind of leadership or ministry. There were rarely any songs or stories about women. I do remember once in Sunday school. Do you know the felt board? Did you ever have felt board? Like little, yeah, okay. So I do remember hearing the story of Ruth once in Sunday school, and there was a little like picture of Ruth like curled up in a ball like a cat. And I just remember her being like put at Boaz's feet, and that's all I kind of remember. So my one memory of a woman being mentioned in church was Ruth kind of curled up next to Boaz. So make of that what you will. So the virtues of submission and obedience were mentioned, but they were highly gendered. So these were spiritual virtues that were really reserved for women. I didn't hear much talk about men needing to be obedient or submissive or to have a virtue of surrender at all. Probably the most damaging influence, I would say, in that culture was also the way sexual purity was discussed. And there was a huge emphasis on it, especially for young women. So the idea of sex was like the worst thing you could do. It's like there's murder and then there's sex, like right up above. I remember the one sex talk I got was this was the extent of it from my mom. Do you have any questions about sex? I think I was like 14 or something. At the time I was like, ugh, because inside I'm like, yes, I have so many questions, but I was like, no. And then she was like, okay, if you ever get pregnant, I'll kill you. And so that was it. That was the sex talk. And then in church context, you would hear, you would go to these sort of youth groups, and then you would hear these sort of strange little scare 'em straight kind of stories like, I'll picture, okay, girls, picture yourself on your wedding day. You're wearing this beautiful white dress. Everyone is there looking at you. You're walking up to your husband. And now imagine a red handprint everywhere a man has touched you. Those sorts of things. Or like, pretend you're a Tootsie Roll that's been like, I don't know, whatever. I won't rehash these, but you can sort of imagine the kinds of stories I heard a lot. So this notion of purity was not a Christian virtue that you gain over time with the help of God's grace, as it is actually described in the New Testament. Rather, purity was something that you have by default, and then you can lose permanently if you have sex, which I did, spoiler alert. So when I was a teenager, and after I had committed the gravest sin possible, the messages I received from my parents and my church told me that I had lost my value and worth as a woman completely, right? So this view of purity as being something you have, and then if you can lose it permanently, right? Which is almost a complete inversion of what really the Christian understanding of purity is. So I began to see myself and deeply internalize that idea that I was damaged goods. So it was in that state, kind of shame and worthlessness, that I went to college. A great time to go to college, right? When you feel like garbage. Okay. And I really quickly embraced feminism. And I was going to a Christian college, actually, an evangelical college where I currently teach. So this wasn't like I was going to PSU or something like, okay, yeah, of course you're a feminist, right? I mean, this was 20 years ago. I was going to an evangelical college. But nonetheless, I very quickly became a feminist. In my first year, I remember a friend asking me, so do you think women can be pastors? And I was like, no. And then by the end of the year, I was writing a term paper called God is a Feminist. So I went pretty quickly from one extreme to the other. And one of the kind of turning points in that switch was a New Testament course I was taking. And we were reading 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians 11, there's some pretty interesting language there about women. Let's see if I can remember. A woman is the glory of man, and man is the glory of God, right? And then it talks about veiling, and women need to cover their head because of the angels. I mean, it gets really trippy really quickly. And I didn't have any tools to kind of understand what was going on. And I remember asking the professor, what does this verse mean? It sounds like there's this hierarchy between women and God, that men are closer to God, and then women down here are just supposed to kind of be under men. And he was like, oh, yeah, let's talk about this over here, right? So he didn't have much to say. And so then I went out on my own to try to figure out what that verse could mean. And that's how I discovered feminist theology and feminist biblical hermeneutics in this thing they call a library. I don't know if you've ever actually been in a library. They have these books on the wall. Anyway, there were a bunch of books there from like the 80s, right? So I was like, oh, wow, what is this? And then once I began reading that, I really jumped in full cannonball. And at first, feminism had a positive effect on my faith. For one thing, it helped me restore a sense of worth before God. So it helped me begin to unlearn or undo some of the harmful beliefs I'd had about women, such as the damaged goods narrative, or the idea that I was somehow incomplete without a man, or that I couldn't be a leader simply because of my sex. Another big influence in my life during college was that I became Anglican. So I started going to an Anglican house church, and that was my first encounter with anything Eucharistic, sacramental, the communion of saints. So I learned about amazing women like St. Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen. I began to sort of pay attention to Mary a little bit, although I still had that Protestant suspicion. And I loved how bodily sacramental worship is, right? And so some of my friends at the same time were becoming Catholic. And so I was aware of Catholicism, and it was kind of beckoning from afar because I was beginning to fall in love with the Eucharist and the saints and sacraments. But I could not get past the idea of an all-male priesthood. That was like my deal breaker. And so Anglicanism seemed like Catholicism's like woke little sister, you know. So I could keep all the perks, but without the patriarchal baggage. And for a while it worked. I was a good little Anglican for a few years. During that time, I went for a semester and studied in Oxford, and that was kind of a golden era of my Christianity and feminism somehow being kind of harmonious. And I was reading Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen. I was going to daily prayer at an Anglican church. But after that, something began to shift. And what happened was, I think, Christianity had been my primary lens, my foundation, and then feminism was something that kind of supplemented that or helped clarify that. But then eventually that flipped, and feminism became my primary lens. So rather than looking at the world through Christianity, I began to look at everything else, including Christianity, through feminism. Near the end of my time as an undergraduate, I remember meeting with my Anglican priest, who was also one of my professors and a mentor. And I was describing to him how it felt as though God had moved behind a wall and there was this separation. And I felt like I couldn't reach him anymore. And so we both concluded that that wall must be patriarchy, right? But the problem is that doesn't actually fit the data. Because at that time in my life, at that very moment in my life, at our little Anglican church, for example, I had rewritten the Our Father as the Our Mother, and we were using that to pray. So I was, for the first time, having a very feminist, kind of centered spirituality. And that's when God felt like he was behind a wall. So it didn't really fit the narrative that, oh, it must be patriarchy. Because it was when I started praying to God as mother that I lost the desire to pray at all. And for the next 10 years, I didn't. I more or less stopped practicing Christianity, even though I still thought of myself as a Christian. So why did that shift happen? Why did my feminist worldview begin to lead me away from Christianity? That's a big question I've been reflecting on and writing on as I've looked back at my conversion story. So one of the big pieces, I think, in that switch was that I had really adopted what's called a feminist hermeneutics of suspicion, right? That's kind of the catchphrase that's used in feminist studies and feminist theory. And hermeneutics means a way of reading, right? Kind of an interpretive lens. And a hermeneutics of suspicion basically means that you read, whether it's a text or the world or an interaction or theology, you read everything with this feminist suspicion. You're on a hunt for patriarchy because it's there. You just got to find it, right? And that's kind of the assumption that that's always at play, that it's almost like this ether that kind of flows through everything, right? So the question isn't like, is patriarchy at work here, but rather, how is patriarchy at work here? So everything becomes viewed from a lens of suspicion. And so what started out as kind of a tool for analysis became totalizing. I became deeply suspicious of God. I became deeply suspicious of the Bible. In these years, I just hated the Bible. I had this almost irrational kind of anger at the Bible. I was suspicious of Christian tradition and history, and I saw all of these as dangerous tools of patriarchy. Well, here's a little secret. It is impossible to love God if you are suspicious of him. And in this period of my life, I was going into graduate school at this point. And yes, I was doing work in English literature, but it was really feminist studies, feminist theory, feminist literary criticism, gender theory, and I was immersing myself in postmodern or post-structuralist feminist theory, like Judith Butler, Ellen Sixu, Luce Irigaray, for any of you who are familiar with that sort of thing. So let me try to explain a little bit about what I mean by postmodern feminism. So the implicit worldview in postmodern feminism is that reality, as we know it, what we think of as reality is always in air quotes, right? Truth, reality, the body, okay. Reality as we see it is completely socially and linguistically constructed. So it's a fiction. It's this kind of social and linguistic fiction that we then perceive to be real. And all stories, all meta-narratives, or narratives that have kind of big explanatory power, especially Christianity, these are simply collective human efforts at meaning-making and nothing more. So Christianity is this meta-narrative that is ultimately constructed by human beings as an attempt to make sense of our experiences and the world and ultimate truth. Now, a worldview like this precludes the possibility of divine grace. In this worldview, God is not speaking into our reality. I was the kind of postmodern that thought, well, yes, out there somewhere there is a God or ultimate truth, but we can't know it. It's like we're living in this closed dome, and all we have are our own words and stories to try to kind of make sense of what might be on the other side of that dome. But that reality on the other side of that dome, from my perspective, was a reality that did not speak. That God that I imagined might be out there was not a self-disclosing being breaking into our world through words and images and through the incarnation to reveal himself to us. Instead, I saw God as a metaphor, a story that was crafted by humans in an attempt to explain what was ultimately unexplainable and to know what is unknowable. Now, sidebar. It's true, if you read mystical theology, that there is a tradition in Christianity that focuses on the incomprehensibility of God ultimately, right? But just because God is beyond our understanding and ultimately incomprehensible does not mean that he is unknowable, because God is also personal and can make himself known, right? So there's a sense in which God is incomprehensible, but he is nonetheless knowable. But from a postmodern perspective, I had also jettisoned the idea that God is knowable at all. So I had completely by then also abandoned the idea of any authoritative divine revelation, right? Because if God is a being that does not speak, then what's divine revelation? There's nothing that's being revealed, right? Everything's kind of a human projection. So I had no standard of truth to which I was beholden. Everything was up for grabs. If I didn't like a particular part of scripture or something in Christian tradition, I could just reject it or revise it. And I did. I spent a lot of time doing that. I crafted a very affirming version of Christianity for myself. A version of Christianity that asked very little of me, in fact, kind of nothing at all, and therefore could offer no real conversion. It was a kind of Christianity where, I was just getting high fives all the time on everything I thought and did. Because I did not see myself in need of redemption. No, Christianity was the one that needed saving. And I was the enlightened feminist prophet sent by me to do just that. It's as if Christianity had become a lovely bouquet of cut flowers, these blooms that had been severed from their roots and could be endlessly rearranged. Well, cut flowers are pretty, but they don't live very long. And so it was with my faith. In this era of my life, which was basically my 20s, it dwindled into almost nothing. So by the end of my 20s, I was in a state of escalating spiritual crisis. I still considered myself a Christian, but I basically had just been sawing off the branch I was sitting on for about 10 years. And things very quickly came to a head. At the beginning of October 2013, I was a disaffected, post-evangelical feminist on the brink of atheism. And by the end of the month, I was on the phone with a Mexican nun asking about joining the Roman Catholic Church. Again, you're probably thinking, wow, she goes through extreme changes quite easily. But the nice thing is God can work with that, right? So my impulsivity, that part of my personality has been a vehicle of God's grace. So what was going on in October 2013? So there were a few threads in this spiritual crisis. So the first one was, so I was teaching at this time. I was a professor at a Christian college. And I was teaching Flannery O'Connor. Dangerous thing to do. And I came across in one of her autobiographical writings an anecdote where she's at a dinner party with some Protestants, and one of them mentions, oh, I just love the Eucharist. It's just such a beautiful symbol. And Flannery says, well, if it's just a symbol, then to hell with it. Ooh, if it's just a symbol, then to hell with it. That became this little bullet that kind of burrowed into me, and I couldn't dig it out, because I had reduced Christianity, everything about Christianity, to just a symbol. Christianity had become this nexus of metaphors that connected only to other metaphors, like this house of mirrors. With that one sentence, that one comment from Flannery, my pseudo-Christianity was unmasked for what it was. And I began to see that my precious postmodern prevarication was just a bunch of bullshit. But I wasn't sure where to turn, because, plot twist, at the same time, my feminism was also for the first time in crisis. And that was largely because I had just become a mother for the first time. So I had experienced pregnancy and childbirth, lactation. I was encountering the awesome reality of femaleness. As it turns out, biological sex is real. It is not a pure construction. And that kind of threw me for a loop, right? Because I had sort of, I was married. I was married at the time. I'd been married for a while. And, we had a pretty just kind of egalitarian, fluid role sort of relationship. And I saw us as just kind of interchangeable. But as soon as we became parents, well, then the body began to matter a lot, right? Because it was my body that had to feed the baby, my body that had to bear the baby. And so all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, maybe this social constructionist thing goes a little overboard. Also, I had become a mother to a son. While I was pregnant, I thought, oh, of course I'll have a girl, and I'll name her like Gloria Steinem or something, and it'll be great. But no, I had a boy. And so that opened my heart in a new way. And I began to pay more attention to and be interested in the lives and struggles of boys and men. Another thing that happened when I became a mother was that my view towards autonomy began to change. Autonomy is really a central value of feminism, particularly in America, and you really see this manifest in the debates surrounding abortion, right? But that idea of autonomy, once I became a mother, no longer had as much explanatory power in my life. I was much more aware of the limits of my autonomy, in fact, and how interdependent we are, and how human beings are interconnected with the lives of other people, not just in networks of oppression, but in networks of love. And I saw this interconnection as a good and beautiful thing, not as an enslaving thing. This is particularly true in pregnancy, right? When you don't have bodily autonomy at all, but your body actually houses the body of another. Around this time, I was on, in this period of my life, I made the poor life decision to be on Twitter. And there was a debate, I think it was in Texas, there was some abortion statute that was being debated, and there was a congresswoman or a state senator or something, who was filibustering it. And I can't remember her name right now. Wendy what? Wendy something, Wendy. And she had like pink tennis shoes on or something. She was filibustering it, and I was streaming the live coverage of it and like tweeting with my feminist Twitterers. And that I was feeling this kind of exhilaration, like, yeah, you go, Wendy. And then I also began to notice a flurry of tweets where women were saying like, I had an abortion, yeah, like it was awesome. And then someone tweeted, someone I was Twitter friends with, like friends, right? And she said, oh, I feel so left out because I haven't had an abortion. And that had a very chilling effect on me, right? I was a new mom. I'd seen the ultrasounds, which also were shocking. I had an ultrasound at 12 weeks because there was something wrong with the umbilical cord. You don't usually have an ultrasound quite right at that time. And I was shocked. I mean, this is the first trimester, right? I was shocked at, on the screen, I could see his whole body, his brain. It looked like cauliflower, and he was just like kicking around, like sucking his thumb. I mean, he was just having the time of it. And I was shocked that in the first trimester, you know, pregnancy is not just a clump of cells. Like, that is a human being, completely recognizable. And so that also began to kind of undermine my feminist outlook, which was very much tied to abortion, because those things are very much packaged together, especially in America. So in the midst of all these crises, I got it stuck in my head, right? So my faith is in crisis, my feminism is in crisis, and I'm like, I can't be at this evangelical university anymore. I don't even know if I believe in God. I should work at a Catholic university. That was my conclusion, which is kind of depressing now that you think about it. But I thought, well, if I work at a Catholic university, then I can still kind of think about faith, but I don't feel this pressure to actually be a Christian. And so I was sitting there at my desk, and this was a couple weeks after I'd started applying for jobs at Catholic places, and I decided that I couldn't do that. I couldn't just uproot my entire family because I was having this existential crisis. And this thought came into my head like a little cartoon bird, just kind of like flew into my head from somewhere else. And the thought was, you don't have to work at a Catholic university to be part of the Catholic Church. And right there, without really thinking, I just Googled Newburgh Catholic Church. That's where I live, in Newburgh, Oregon. And St. Peter's popped up, and I called. Again, without really thinking, I don't know, like, what was going on. I called on the phone to the parish, and someone answered, which never happens. Holy Spirit's busy. And it was Sister Juanita. And I said something to the effect of, hi, I think I might be kind of interested in maybe exploring Catholicism. And she was like, come to the church. And so I came to the church, and she asked, so why do you want to become Catholic? And I was surprised to hear myself, just this flood of desire come out in words. I said, the Eucharist, the sacraments, all this kind of pent up longing I'd had for Catholicism that I had run away from because I couldn't make it fit my feminism. Now that my feminism had kind of weakened, I guess, that armor had chinks in it, now all that desire for Catholicism kind of flooded back. And so I very quickly became Catholic. And I became Catholic before I had resolved all of my feminist objections. So that's why joining the Catholic Church for me was not actually the culmination of a profound inner conversion, but it was the catalyst for a profound inner conversion. Because it was really in that first year or two of becoming Catholic that I began to have an internal change and a complete worldview inversion, which is incredibly disorienting and painful and really awesome if you ever get the chance to experience it. You're Catholic now, so I hope you don't. I hope you stick with the Catholic worldview. But conversion is still possible even if you are Catholic, right? Because it's this inner transformation. So the next part of my conversion story is very complex and multifaceted, and it unfolds over a period of years. And so I'm not going to map out the whole story, but I do want to highlight kind of two key illuminations that really changed the way that I used to see. And the first one is this. My inner conversion began when I rediscovered the bedrock spiritual virtue of surrender. The virtues that I had learned to despise as a feminist, like humility, obedience, submission, surrender, without realizing it, those had crippled me spiritually because I was no longer open to God. I had closed myself off. I had become hardened and closed to the grace of God because of that suspicion, right? The attitude of suspicion is completely antithetical, almost the opposite of the spiritual posture of surrender. But surrender is the beginning of the spiritual life. And you see this most clearly and most powerfully in the Annunciation, which for me has now become one of the most kind of important parts of my Catholic spiritual life, is trying to lean into and live into the Annunciation. Mary's yes in that moment, that is a microcosm of the entire Christian life for both men and women. Hearing the good news and saying yes. And then that good news takes root within you and bears fruit. That's what we're all called to do, is to be little Marys and give birth to little Christs, right? But I had learned through feminist theory to read Mary's yes as a negative thing, as something oppressive, like she's saying yes to patriarchy, rather than the ultimate expression of human freedom. As the freest thing a human has ever done, Mary's yes. And that's what makes us free, is making her yes our own. Now, it's true that submission is too often used as a bludgeon against women, especially in the culture of my upbringing. It is not good when in Christian circles we say, yes, women, surrender, be submissive and humble, without actually saying, no, actually that is what we're all called to do. Those are spiritual virtues for all of us. But I had erred in going to the other extreme entirely and just rejecting those virtues altogether. And the most important illumination, the one that really enabled a total worldview inversion, was a restoration of the cosmos, specifically a sacramental cosmos. So remember, in my postmodern feminist understanding, all of reality is constructed by human-made signs and symbols. Now, Catholicism is very into symbols. I don't know if you've noticed. Very into signs. But the difference is those signs and symbols make known the invisible reality of God. There's something beyond them that is coming through them. They're not just these human-made signs and symbols that are echoing our own voices back to us. The grace of God that is alive and active in the world elevates those signs to sacraments. And the world, and especially our bodies, are sacred signs, living icons that reveal the reality of a loving God who is seeking to make himself known. Let me say a little bit more what I mean by bodies as living icons. So the primary metaphor that we're given in Christian scripture and tradition in order to understand the relationship between God and humankind is a nuptial metaphor. It's the metaphor of marriage and conjugal union, right? You have this metaphor in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament, where it takes the form of Christ and the bride, the church. Right? So back to 1 Corinthians 11, remember that passage that kind of sent me spinning off into the library to read about feminism. So the verse that sparked that feminist awakening, I didn't have the theological context to understand it, but it reads totally differently in the light of a sacramental cosmos, because that passage is about the nuptial metaphor, in which male human beings, are images of God, and women are images of humankind in the metaphor of the marriage between God and humankind. Now, this does not mean that like men are more godlike, or they're like somehow closer to God, right? This is a metaphor of the relation. This is not a metaphor about men and women in isolation. And so women are icons of humanity as a whole. We are representative of humankind. Humankind is meant to receive God's grace, which brings new life, right? So the fact that we have bodies that is able to receive and bring life, that is a sign of the relationship between humankind as a whole in relation to God. Postmodern theory puts so much emphasis on doing over being because we have no intrinsic pre-social meaning. So we always have to be doing our gender, creating our own identity and meaning, rather than recognizing that there is meaning. There's a givenness to our bodies, to the world. And these are imbued with not just meaning, but sacred meaning. And we don't have to do anything. We don't have to earn this or accomplish this. We carry this sacred meaning in our very bodies simply by being. It is our birthright. It's realizing this that resolved my objections to an all-male priesthood. Because the male priest is serving an iconic function in the Mass. He's a visible, living icon of Christ, the bridegroom. The Catholic Sacramental Cosmos restores in its fullness the masculine and the feminine, and the fruitful synergy that is possible between them. I'm going to end by just reading a couple of paragraphs from the book I wrote about my conversion that captures this idea, I think, pretty well, if I must say so. And I will say, I do switch tenses in this passage, and I just want you to know that that's intentional. I am an English professor, and I realize that's happening. All right. Years before I was Catholic, I went on a trip to Ireland with a group of students and 2 colleagues. While in Dublin, we had the opportunity to attend evening prayer at a Church of Ireland cathedral. Remembering with fondness the Anglican prayer gatherings of my college years, I looked forward to this, assuming it would draw me into a sense of fullness, give me a taste of the transcendent, something I hadn't felt in years. We arrived a little early, filing into pews of dark wood. The first thing I noticed was that the church was empty, except for us, a ragtag group of American tourists. I glanced around, surprised to see no iconography whatsoever, just a contrasting interplay between light shades and dark, some abstract embellishments here and there. Then a convoy of men marched up the center aisle, all dressed in black and white, faces grimly set. They processed ahead in silence, carrying a lone metal staff raised aloft with nothing on it, no crucifix, not even a cross, just a blank phallic rod. That image captures the spirit of the prayer service itself, disincarnate, dreary, and resolutely masculine, fully shorn of anything bodily or feminine. Rather than pulled into a sense of God, I was repelled, my feminist suspicions confirmed. I was suddenly hyper-aware of my womanhood, and not in a positive sense, but as a spiritual defect, an aberration that expelled me from the Holy of Holies, as if I'd come to pray and been caught trespassing on masculine ground. Days later, on a Sunday, we are in Galway, attending Mass at the Catholic Cathedral. After my experience in Dublin, I am pessimistic. The Church of Ireland ordains women, after all. Yet their cathedral and prayer service had been dismally masculine. How much worse would a Catholic Mass be? I enter the cathedral and immediately feel as though I am no longer inside a building at all. The space is cruciform, like a body itself, and rows of arches draw my eye up and up and up. Stained glass colors the light that funnels in through the many windows. The heart of the space, above the altar, opens into a basilica overhead that is filled with blue light, as if it's not an additional chamber, but a portal into the sky. Beyond the altar, I see an icon of the crucified Christ gazing down at his mother, who is staring up at him from the foot of the cross, alongside the apostle whom Jesus loved. Looking at them, looking at each other, I am pulled into their tender sorrow. Alongside me, down the long end of the cruciform, flanking the rows of pews, is a series of archways within archways that evokes a sense of infinity, of doors opening into other doors opening. I am a body, surrounded by other bodies, and together we are within this larger body, which is both a cathedral in Galway and something else entirely. Not that we've been lifted to another realm, instead, that other realm has come to us. As I sit, transfixed by the space, something wells up behind and above me, so instantly omnipresent that I cannot trace the source. It seems to come from everywhere, music. Music made by voices alone, male and female intertwined. A synergy of harmony made possible only by the different registers, the highs and the lows that plow over the earth and curve along the underside of heaven, gathering all that lies between into a tremulous golden chord. Thank you. Okay. Do we need to pass the mic back and forth? Okay.
So Tyler, for everybody in the audience, Tyler's going around, or will be going around momentarily, with a big popcorn bowl, and you can put your questions in there. And what we'll try to do with our hybrid format is mix one question from the Zoom audience and one from here. And so Abby will be sending me the questions on my phone, and if I'm looking down, it's not because I'm bored at that point. And I'll just start us off, and then we'll get going in that direction. So what I was thinking as you were speaking, and having heard you in the past, is through your conversion narrative, there's this rehash of this wonderful journey in which we can all see the activity of the Holy Spirit, the presence of God. And I think what's most remarkable about it for so many people is that it's coming in such an unforeseen, sort of sweep you off your feet kind of way. But there can be this tendency, all of us here, wanting to hear more of that, and we can be like, the audience of a musician asking for that album again, those songs again that we've all heard. So I wanted to give you an opportunity just off the bat to talk about what's been going on, the way that the Holy Spirit has been driving you more recently. And then after that, hopefully we can dip back into some of your story.
That's a great question. Yeah, it's really nice when you have a conversion experience and God sends you a bunch of delicious consolations. It's like you're a little baby and you get all the sweet milk. And then you get weaned, That's not always how it is. So, yeah, I think when the rush of conversion is over and the dust kind of settles, then conversion still continues, but it begins to be much more of like the long road, right, of the spiritual life. And in the tradition I was raised within, emotional highs were very much kind of the barometer of your relationship with God and how close God was. Like if you felt that emotional high, that means God's there. If you don't, he's not. And so it's been really refreshing to reframe that from a Catholic perspective, and to know that when I experience those consolations, that's wonderful, but it's like an extra gift, right? It's not that God isn't present when I don't feel those sorts of consolations. One of I think the things that has been going on more in my life has been really living into a Marian consecration that I started, you'll be shocked by this, impulsively, and have then begun figuring out like what that means and how to live that out, and really trying to begin understanding the Marian virtues, especially the ones that I kind of am like kind of repelled by, like gentleness. But I've been praying, I've actually been praying a lot since May, especially for a spirit of gentleness with my kids, especially. And it's been really wonderful that I've seen that bear fruit. And yeah, I would say and then also learning how to be really present and to pay attention. I think very recently, like in the last week and a half, I've been very convicted about how easily I try to distract myself from my life by that infernal device, the smartphone. Reading about the election or the riots in Portland, or how like we're on the brink of civil war or whatever, and getting so caught up in that I'm distracting myself from my life. And so I've been really trying to kind of turn the wheel in another direction and to be much more present in the moment. So I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. So I just got past the pile, and it's immediately evident that we have way too many questions already, but we'll get through what we can. In order of in which they were received, could you talk more about the spiritual meanings of male and female bodies? That is, what are the main sources from scripture and the tradition that speak to this meaning?
Okay, well, as I mentioned before, I think the really big one is the nuptial metaphor. So you see that really spelled out like in Ephesians 5 and Corinthians 11 are key passages, Song of Songs, the whole thing. Genesis is big. I'm writing a book now that digs more into the relationship between Catholicism and feminism. And I just wrote a whole 7,000 word chapter on Genesis because that's our origin story, right? And origin stories are important because they're connected to identity and purpose. So if we really want to understand our identity as male and female, then we have to kind of go back to our origin story and really dig into it. And Christ himself in Matthew, he directs, when questioned about marriage and divorce, he directs the attention to Genesis. And so he's like, yeah, that's still relevant. That's still our origin story and how we understand our identity and our purpose. And John Paul II's Theology of the Body, his collection of homilies that spend a lot of time on Genesis and Song of Songs and that passage in Matthew that I'm talking about. That's an excellent resource. And Edith Stein as well. Edith Stein is a saint, Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, also a philosopher, and she wrote about women and men and influenced John Paul II, actually. So I think that's where I would sort of say dig into those resources specifically.
Okay, so the first question that we received from Zoom is, what is the title of your book, which I can answer? It's Into the Deep. So we're going to move back to our audience here, swing the balance back in our favor. And what are you going to teach your kids about sex and sexuality?
Yes. Oh, that's such a great question. And it's one I'm definitely still trying to figure out. So my oldest is 7. And he's starting to ask questions like, how are babies made? And I'm like, well, okay. So I need to figure this out quickly. And well, so for a while, I had a good sense of what I wasn't going to teach my kids about sex. Like, I'm not going to teach them that their spiritual worth is contingent upon sex and can be lost permanently or something. But I think the Catholic view of sexuality has so many more resources about sex, because I think from an evangelical perspective, the narrative tended to be, just like, hold your knees together till you get married and then it'll be fine. And as it turns out, like that you don't get much preparation within marriage for how to live out sex faithfully. And I think there are some messages in our culture that especially tell women, that women are supposed to make themselves sexually available on demand, right? And so I think those expectations get imported into marriage as well. And so I think we have a lot of unlearning that we have to do when it comes to sex. And so I think I'm going to do my best to really lean on the theology of the body and to teach my kids to begin to think in a very incarnational way about sex and about how it's connected to the transmission of human life primarily. I think in our culture, we tend to talk about sex very much just recreationally, rather than it having an intrinsic connection to human life. And so I really want to raise my children to have a very deep and conscious awareness of the fact that they are fertile beings and that means something significant, and so that sex is for a specific purpose, and that everyone, no matter what your vocation is, no matter what your desires are, your sexual desires are, everyone is called to live in a way where we submit our sexuality to the truth that it's connected to life, right? Married people have to do that too. They do, you know, and it can be rough. People who are not called to marriage have to do that too. Whether you experience same-sex desire or not, you know, we're all kind of in the same boat when it comes to that. And so I want to try to speak about sex in a way that resists the kind of categorizations that happen as well in terms of sexual identity in our culture, but that connection between sex and life, and how our bodies themselves are organized around our capacities to give life, right? And that can kind of tell us about the meaning of sex. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about. Yeah, but that's such a good question. I'll let you know in like 10 years.
Okay, the next question brings up, even in the framing of it, there's some trickiness here. So the question is, how would you describe the role of feminist thought in your life and study now? And the reason why I add in that caveat is it's a complicated thing to say, right? What is feminism? You can talk about there being multiple waves of feminism. There's a certain set of propositions that you would say you agree with at some point that you then transcend or reject. And so how would you, I think there's a deeper question that needs to be asked too about the compatibility of Catholicism and feminism, and how do we talk around all of that quickly?
Okay, quickly is hard because this is what I'm writing a book on right now. I'm in the middle of it. I'm just, the chapter I've been working on, I'm up to the tail end of it, is on the feminist worldview and how to even talk about that. Because as you mentioned, Michael, there's waves of feminism and then different streams and different varieties. And there's, you know, feminism is this kind of chaotic universe itself. So I would say that the first part of that question was, how does feminist theory inform what my thinking now? And I guess I would say that the sources that really inform me are the Catholic ones, honestly, because I think that most feminist theory, at least that's been written since, let's say, the 1940s or 50s, stems from a worldview that's really different, even diametrically opposed to a Catholic worldview. And so while Catholicism and feminism share certain goals and interests in terms of the health and well-being and value of women, if we're using kind of a medical analogy, I would say they have very different views on who the patient is, what the sickness is, and what the treatment is. So I think what basically the question I'm wrestling with in this book is, like, is a Catholic feminism possible? If so, what does it look like? And I think it would have to look pretty different from the ground up, because Catholicism and what now feminism has kind of become in our time have a different conception of the human person, and have a fundamentally different conception of reality. And so that really changes things pretty drastically. And so right now I'm writing through that, if that makes sense. Because feminist theory has kind of gotten itself into the strange predicament of questioning the existence of women altogether, in like what it means to be a woman, and being very kind of suspicious toward that very category. And I think that's a pretty big departure from the aims and goals of what feminism is supposed to be about. And yeah, so there's a lot to explore there. But yeah, I'm like in the midst. I'm in the trenches on this question right now and writing a lot about it.
Okay, well, just kind of in the interest of continuing that, I also feel bad that I said quickly, and I was talking about what will be the next topic of your book. So clearly that's impossible. But with that in mind, the whole, I mean, because I think we do tend to get into this binary paradigm of, you know, assent to one belief system requires falling out entirely from another. And you talked about how most of the models that are really starting to influence you are coming directly from the Catholic Church. What would you say of maybe advances in secular thought, whether that be in the most recent wave of feminism or earlier, that have been pivotal and influential and important? In other words, is there something that the Catholic Church might have to learn from that which was innovated from outside the church? Is there a confluence or a kind of harmony that can be struck? Just kind of working in that territory, what would you say?
Yeah, I do think there's a danger in being kind of either or, us versus them, which is a very un-Catholic way of thinking about things. So I think Thomas Aquinas is a really good model for how we can approach different ways of thinking, right? Because Thomas Aquinas, arguably the greatest theologian, Christian theologian and philosopher, drew a lot. He was influenced by pagan philosophers like Aristotle. He was influenced by Muslim philosophers and Jewish philosophers. So he wasn't like, oh, heresy, you know, but rather he took the ideas that were beneficial and helped him to more deeply understand his own Christianity. And so I think we can do a similar thing with feminism, right? But the important thing is that the foundation, the underlying worldview, needs to be deeply Catholic. And I've been thinking about this question because I've been noticing, like in the chapter I'm writing now, I've been focusing a lot on the things I see, the ideas I see in feminism that are at odds with Christianity. And so I've been trying to think, okay, well, what does it look, what are the valuable ideas that we can glean from feminism? And I think it might be kind of rolling things back toward more the first wave of feminism. And because I think it's very important that women are given legal equality with men. I think we live in a society where that has already happened. I honestly don't think that like women are oppressed in 21st century America. But one of the biggest things that I do think is still a problem that affects women and girls, that there are definitely some feminist voices, secular feminist voices, that are advocating in this arena as well, is the hypersexualization of women and girls, and kind of the pornification of our culture, and then even broader, more globally, the problem of sex trafficking. So those are things that I think you have secular feminists writing about and paying attention to as well. The recent controversy about that film on Netflix, Cuties, yeah. That wasn't just like religious conservatives getting angry about that. So I think that is a place where there can be common ground. They're a very, they're a minority, but there are secular pro-life feminists as well. And I think there are things that feminists, secular feminists and Catholic feminists can find common ground are really fighting for maternity leave, especially for women. I think that's a commonality. I think questioning the kind of surrogacy industry is a big problem, especially if you want to talk about the commodification of women's bodies and how women in the third world are being used to kind of make babies for rich Westerners. I think that's a big problem. But because of the kind of staunch pro-choice position of most feminists, I think they kind of don't want to talk about that. They also don't want to talk about, say, in places like China, where women are sort of forced to have abortions, like forced abortions is a big problem. So I think there are ways you know, in very kind of concrete, practical ways, Catholic feminists and secular feminists can partner with on shared goals, even if the reason they come to that shared understanding is maybe different. And also, I will say that the movement from secular feminists who are pushing back against some of the more extreme gender ideologies that are saying basically that, you know, women don't exist and we have to kind of define men and women by simply what people say that they are, because that threatens sex segregated spaces that exist for women's benefit, like women's sports, women's prisons, women's shelters. And and also the kind of move um, in America and in the UK, where you see increasingly young women, ages like late teens, early 20s, are transitioning to become transgender in exponential rates. There's just this huge explosion of that. And so there's becoming more and more attention from a secular feminist perspective on why we should be worried about that. Like, why do so many of our teenage girls suddenly want to become boys? Like, that's something that we should be looking at. And that the pushback against that is really happening in the UK, and a lot of secular feminists are driving that. I hope that happens in the US as well. There's a big court case going on in the UK. I'm not sure if you're aware, but a young woman who was kind of pushed to transition physically and medically early is now kind of suing the NHS because they basically kind of ruined her life by pushing her into an early transition. And so she's in court now, like arguing her case. And so that's something to pay attention to. And again, I hope that kind of pushback we're seeing in the UK happens as well in the US. So that's something that secular and Catholic feminists can and should be partnering to combat.
Okay, so turning the page a little bit to, I guess you could say, feminism as such, to this issue of the relationship between men and women, which is always going to be a vital part of the picture. We have the question: what does male privilege, or how rather, does male privilege affect our society, and what should we be doing to ensure equitable privileges between the sexes? And before I hand over the mic, I think you might maybe comment too on that kind of language, privilege, male privilege. Is that the kind of language that we should be adopting? Should we adopt it with certain qualifications? How do we best treat that sort of issue? And to repeat the question again, how does male privilege affect our society, and what should we be doing to ensure equitable privileges between the sexes?
I remember recently I was riding my bike home from work. Maybe I had just done some riding or something. And I noticed I was riding up the street toward my house, which is also near the Catholic Church. And on the other side of the street was a man who was walking this way, and he was clearly had some kind of disability. He was limping. And it was a Friday around dinner time, and it occurred to me that he was probably walking home from the free meals that our church, our parish gives for people on Fridays. And I remember watching him and thinking, like, you know, he's white, a male, but he's clearly poor, maybe homeless, I don't know, disabled. And here I was, like, riding my bike from my well-paying job home to my warm house with a healthy body. And this thought fleetingly crossed my mind, like how overly simplistic the concept of male privilege is, in the way that it's often used as this kind of bludgeon, you know, like, which is sort of ironic, right? Because male privilege as an idea arises from the theory of what's called intersectionality, which is basically the idea that depending on someone's identity, there might be kind of a layer of different kinds of oppression that person experiences, right? So like a Black woman is going to maybe experience oppression or discrimination related to both race and sex in a way that a white woman isn't. And I think that basic idea is a very valuable tool, and it has the the capacity to really expand our compassion toward people. But I think the problem is in practice, it doesn't often tend to extend to people like white men, right? So my thought when I rode past that man, that was kind of an intersectional thought in the sense that I was aware of his, not just his race and his sex, but also his class and his ability. But you don't really hear people talking that way, right? We tend to talk in like, oh, white men, you know, have nothing important to say, or they're always in a privileged position. But I think the way that rhetoric has taken shape tends to actually dehumanize people in a way that I don't think is helpful, and I don't think is a Catholic way of seeing. So I think it is a Catholic perspective to consider the ways in which oneself, like the ways in which we are like privileged or blessed by God, or we have been given gifts by God that are not just for us to kind of hoard, but we can actually put those gifts to use in ways that will help other people. So it's very important in a Catholic perspective and in the Catholic understanding of social justice. I mean, Catholicism coined the phrase social justice and having a preferential option for the poor. Like that's really at the heart of Catholic teaching. But there also is this sense of like paying attention to the human person and seeing each person as an icon of Christ, like treating each person as Christ. So not doing this calculation of like, okay, what race, what class are you? Okay, like how should I value you or interact with you on this kind of like hierarchy of oppression? If that calculus is making you treat certain people in a different way, or to disregard them or dehumanize them, then I don't think that's a helpful way of thinking. But it's also not a helpful way of thinking to be totally blind to the ways in which different people, because of their circumstances, have different challenges. And I think one of the weaknesses of the male privilege idea is that it overlooks the ways in which men also face challenges in society, you know, in terms of like suicide rates are sky high for men. What's going on there? Men are the ones who often take the brunt in unemployment when the economy tanks. So I think it's much better to think about how our well-being is interconnected and how the well-being of women and men, it's not a zero-sum game, right? But we have to be in this together, and we have to pay attention to the challenges that women face because they are women, right? We have to give voice to those, and we have to pay attention to those. But we also can't just like, you know, wave our hands and think like, you know, men don't have their own challenges as well. So I guess that's sort of my big little thought about male privilege.
All right, now a question in reference to what we've been talking about that's a little bit out of left field, certainly a valid question. What are your thoughts on female deacons or deaconesses in the church?
You know, I'll be totally honest, I have not done a ton of reading or thinking about this. So I am hesitant to give an uninformed opinion. I don't know enough of the debate. I would need to read more about it. So sorry, it's lame. But I don't want to like just talk myself out on a limb and then realize like, oh shoot.
Yeah, when we bring you back in a year, we'll talk about that. As a former Protestant, how hard do you consider it to be for a fervent and devout Protestant woman to consider and eventually embrace Catholic teaching? Do you, I might add to this, do you think it's important to steer Protestant women that you know in that direction? How would you broach the topic of the conversation of the Catholic faith and the importance of coming into the fold, so to speak, to the fervent and devout Protestant women that you know?
So I think I mentioned before, I teach at a Protestant college. I teach at George Fox. So I'm surrounded by Protestants, and some of them are women. Now I don't try to actively make my students Catholic, for example. But I do live visibly as a Catholic. I present Catholic opinions regularly in the classroom, in my writing. And then students, especially a lot of female students, they want to come and hear more, and they ask me a lot of questions, and I answer those questions. And they often have to do with, the role of the women in the church, or they're interested in kind of Mary. They're like, well, what's going on there? But I'm kind of interested. Um, they're drawn to the incarnational nature of the Catholic faith, but I really let the Holy Spirit lead. So I very much think that conversion is God's business, and we have to be open to God using us in His work of conversion. And so that's what I try to do. I try to be available when, but usually it's when I talk to Protestant women about Catholicism, it's because they've kind of come to me with certain questions they're thinking about, and so I just talk honestly with them about what they're thinking. And I try also to be very charitable to Protestantism as well, while also being, honest, like, yeah, I think sola scriptura is a really big problem, like, because what's the ground of that authority, right? And so I'm also frank about what I see as the weaknesses in the Protestant position. But my real goal is that they are drawn further into a rich devotion to Christ, right? And so that's my real desire. And I do believe that the fullness of Christianity is found in the Catholic Church. And so I certainly desire that for everyone. But I also know that happens kind of at God's God's will and timing.
Okay, so speaking of that Protestant world out there in Newburgh, how has your or the advent, I should say, of your Catholic faith influenced your teaching, especially with respect to women's issues and gender issues?
That's great. So around the same time I became Catholic, I started doing all my teaching in our Great Books program. And that was so wonderful because I began to read along with my students through Christian tradition in a way that I hadn't. I began to read things like Augustine's Confessions, Athanasius on the Incarnation, which is like one of my favorite books. And so I was discovering this kind of new tradition alongside my students, and that was really wonderful because it helped me build a solid foundation. And I've taught a course on gender theory twice since becoming Catholic, and both times were just awful. It's just awful. Like I don't know if I ever want to teach that again, because it made me realize how deeply ideological gender studies is. And if you're not on board with the ideology, then the students who are in the course, who kind of already are, they just get mad at you because you're trying to kind of get them to ask questions that are more foundational. Like the last time I taught it, I structured the entire course where we read the kind of like heavy hitters in feminist and gender theory, who are almost all from an atheist secular perspective. But then I also had them read Catholic voices and Christian voices as well, because I wanted to get them to pay attention to the level of worldview, like what's the underlying worldview in these ideas, and where's the commonality, but then where are the departures? And it was really difficult, I think, but also good. I don't know. It's hard to do because I think also the problem is a lot of gender theory is written in such an obscure and jargon-heavy way, almost intentionally so, that I also felt like I was giving my students things to read that they wouldn't necessarily understand, but then because they didn't quite understand the implications, they would just be like, this sounds great, So that's been something that I haven't really figured out how to do. I think I would love to teach a class like on theology of gender or something. I would love to do an immersive class on gender that really just takes the foundational worldview of Christianity because it's really hard to kind of do the battle through gender theory. And yeah, and the students who tend to take that class, you know, they just tend to be very, some of them, not all of them, but the ones that are most vocal, they just are very resistant to anything that doesn't follow kind of the standard narrative. And I also found it very hard to get them to follow a line of argument. They would sort of like pivot pretty quickly into a different question. And so it was kind of like, I felt like I was, every time I would go into that class, I felt like I was trying to like grab an eel underwater, you know, like, come here, you know, and they're like, woohoo, like, but what about this? And what about this? And yeah, so it was tough, but I think it was also probably tough because I was still in the throes of my own conversion at the time. And so I think I would be better poised to teach that class now. I think I have thicker skin than I used to.
Okay, so we have time for one last question. And I thought, looking at the bevy of options we have here, that what we'll do is bring us full circle. And actually, we have two questions that are very closely related. So I'm going to ask them both. And in so asking, you'll see a bit of a connection between Mary's yes and perhaps your own journey of surrender into faith. And the first question is, can you explain more about your understanding of Mary's yes in the Annunciation and how that bears true freedom? And the second question is, can you explain the concept of giving up autonomy? How does that lead to more freedom?
Okay, those are both great questions. I think I might start with the second one. So there is a sense in which autonomy is absolutely important and necessary, right? And you actually see that in the Annunciation. So God comes to Mary and asks for her assent, right? She has to give her yes. So in the Catholic understanding of everything, are the fact that we have to we have this kind of freedom, right? And then we have to say yes to God, right? We're not Calvinists. We're not just going to get either like saved or damned based on kind of God's whim. We have to say yes. And so any kinds of, I guess, earthly and temporal forms of oppression that take away someone's sense of self, you know, things like slavery or abuse, you know, that those kinds of sin that erode that sense of human freedom are really pernicious, right? And something that we need to fight against for the sake of the gospel, because we need to be free to give ourselves to God, right? So there's this kind of movement in Catholic understanding of self-gift. Like that's what our primary telos or our goal is, to give ourselves over in love. But in order to be able to do that, you have to have a self to give, if that makes sense. So I would say that's the big difference between maybe a Catholic understanding of freedom and a feminist understanding of freedom, where it's almost like freedom is just the freedom to have absolutely as many choices as possible. And it doesn't really matter what you choose as long as you have the freedom to choose something. And so it's kind of this view of freedom from things. Whereas I think a Christian understanding of freedom is, true freedom is the ability to choose the good. It is the ability to choose what we're meant for. And that there are choices we can make that are actually bad for us, that enslave us. And so freedom is being able to say yes to God fully and to surrender oneself. So that's the kind of paradox, that freedom is found in surrender, because that's how we truly become ourselves and what we're made for. So it's more freedom to rather than freedom from, if that makes sense. And I don't know if that, so I guess one layer in the Annunciation as well, and this gets to the Catholic understanding of the Immaculate Conception, so Mary's own Immaculate Conception. So she's given the grace beforehand to be able to say yes to God in complete freedom. And that's something that is, you know, she gets that gift, right? So Mary is free as a human being in a way that no one else is. And I think that's because what God was asking of her was something so intimate that required her entire personhood, her body, her soul, everything, that if she had had any kind of sin, then there would have been a part of her that was saying no to God. And then that means that her yes would have been compromised. And that would have been a kind of violation in a way, right? So her yes had to be completely free and completely wholehearted, and no part of her twisting away from God and saying no. And I think that the Immaculate Conception then is the power that God gives her to be truly free to say yes. And that's what's so beautiful about that moment and why that gift matters so much. And so, for us, we have this kind of concupiscence, right? This inclination to twist away from God. And so our yes is kind of compromised. And so we are working with God's grace to continually say yes, to God. But that is what leads to true freedom, because freedom isn't just this like open-ended journey that has no destination, but it's freedom for a specific end, which is communion with God. So that which makes us free to be united to God in love, that's what true freedom is from Catholic perspective.
Thanks so much. And I think with that, we should allow you to get back to your family and carry on with your day. I think I speak for all of us when I say we appreciate your candor, your depth of thought, and giving your time to our community. So those of us here, we can give a round of applause. On Zoom, do as you please.